Well, want to say welcome to everyone who's attending the session. Thank you for coming, and thank you for being at Drupal Camp Asheville and virtually. So we want to encourage everyone to post questions, and I will collect those out of the chat window. I'm going to turn off my video here and hand this over. Your speaker today is going to be Stephen Pashby, who is an account manager at Design Hammer, which is a full-service website strategy, design, and development agency based out of Durham, North Carolina. He has been working on Drupal websites as a project manager and consultant for nearly a decade. Stephen oversees most analytics implementations at Design Hammer. When not working, and before the pandemic, Stephen was actively involved with USA Fencing as a coach, referee, and veteran national competitor. So don't make him mad. He lives in Durham, North Carolina with his wife and their 3 cats. Stephen, take it away.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm excited to kind of talk about Google Tag Manager and Google Analytics and kind of how they work together. So a quick overview of kind of what we'll cover today. Trying to start with a bit of basics about Google Analytics and then talk about Google Tag Manager. And I want to give you guys a couple of common Google Tag Manager patterns. And then we can kind of talk more about customization and testing and sort of how to kind of roll your own tags and some other neat stuff like that. And then kind of tie things off at the end with any questions or other thoughts that folks have. I'm an account manager at Design Hammer. As the intro said, I've been working on Drupal sites for about 10 years, though not as a developer, more as a PM or helping with a strategy or analytics implementation. A quick caveat, I am not a JavaScript developer, so there will be a hard technical limit of technical questions I can answer, but I think I can help folks get some pretty useful stuff. So one of the questions I had, and you could just maybe identify yourself a little bit in chat, and then maybe just kind of let me know what the kind of group is. Just to kind of tailor this a little bit. Do we have developers here, or site builders, or project managers, or site owners, or anyone that's not one of those categories? Just kind of drop that in. And also, if you've got any experience with Google Analytics or Google Tag Manager, just to kind of, call that out too. Assuming not a lot, but if you're an expert and everyone knows Google Analytics, I can kind of breeze through that pretty quickly. All right, so we'll start off talking a bit about Google Analytics. So Google Analytics is a web analytics service provided by Google. It's been around since 2005, so it is in fact 15 years old. It's free to use, and it's really commonly used with kind of built with data, which was just a service I looked at to get some idea of market footprint. Built with reports over 29 million sites worldwide using it. So out of the box, it does things that are, I think, kind of important to keep in mind when you're thinking about your analytics, so that you can really understand what's happening. Because I think it's really common that folks will basically put Google Analytics on a site, and then they'll launch the site, and they'll come back to the analytics after a month or a quarter or a year, and then they'll be like, what does this tell me? And they'll either not be able to have any data that they can interpret, or they'll get kind of down some rabbit holes about, well, what about devices and all sorts of kind of, they just kind of go down the rabbit hole, and they come up, hours later without anything actionable, from their time that they spent poring over analytics. So I think it's helpful to kind of keep in mind what analytics does out of the box, so that you kind of think about it the right way. So kind of at its core, analytics does kind of 2 things. It tracks page views because the analytics code is implemented on a page, and when that page loads, it fires off and sends a page view to Google Analytics. And then it uses cookies to track users. And most of the useful stuff that it gets from that is trying to determine if it is a unique user, a unique visitor to a given site, and the session that that user is in. Basically, everything else is inferred user behavior based on these two pieces. Whether there's a page view, whether there's multiple page views with a visitor who has the unique visitor cookie, and whether they're over a certain period of time that it sort of assumes is a session. That's kind of it. So, anything like users versus new users, that's whether there's a new unique visitor cookie is detected, right? Sessions by user, right? So that's if they sort of say, we had a certain number of page views in a certain period of time for this user, we assume that's a session. Someone can easily mess this up if they've got, if they're browsing in an incognito window or any of a number of other things. And so sessions, like average sessions per user or pages per session or average session duration, that's all just averages. The bounce rate is we loaded a page for a user and then we didn't load any other pages for that. All of that is just inferred metrics from those, very limited amount of data. So, I mean, that's all well and good. I mean, it does that. But I mean, I think it's a very real question. Are these metrics actually useful, right? I think often, if you think about it, you're not really trying to figure out how many times different pages were viewed. You're trying to figure out, is your site doing something, right? And so in e-commerce, you think of a conversion, but I think broadly speaking, you probably want someone to do something on your site, right? It could be download a resource. It could be complete a sale. It could be like a contact form. And there's some e-commerce connections for Google Analytics, and that's it's kind of its own thing. But a lot of stuff that you want is kind of outside of e-commerce and outside of page views. So I think it's really helpful when you're kind of thinking about this is what's your site trying to accomplish? Like kind of state that in a positive, affirmative way. And it's a lot of times it's, a nonprofit's goals are going to be very different than, like a B2B or a B2C sort of business. And, being able to speak to, okay, we're trying to get leads, or we're trying to get this information out. We're trying to sign up volunteers. We're trying to do whatever. So once you kind of can nail down what your site's trying to accomplish, then you can start to figure out what conversions are. But you'll pretty quickly find that the kind of the default metrics that you can get from Google Analytics, page views, and unique users and sessions, they don't really, they don't really tell you much about which users are converting on your site, and they also don't tell you much about maybe a more important group, which users are not converting on the site. So, I mean, I think it's it's one of these things that once you start to look at it, is like there's not a lot of usefulness unless you're selling ads or using the whole e-commerce kind of additional functionality for Google Analytics. If you're not in one of those two places, you kind of need a little more than what Google Analytics does out of the box. So some specific conversions that are not tracked by default by Google Analytics are form submissions, file downloads, offsite link clicks, and really any sort of interactions with specific page elements. Really most stuff that you might want to know, it's not delivered by default if you just install the analytics code. But Google knows that, and so they extended what analytics provides a while ago with custom events. So basically, analytics also has the ability to track other user interactions using custom events. It's a very flexible system about what can be tracked, and it kind of allows you to analyze the data in pretty interesting ways. But an important caveat is while Google Analytics can interpret the custom events that it receives, they still need to be submitted by your site, right? So you can't do anything in analytics to say, oh, I want to track form submissions on this page, or I want to track file downloads. It's just the code, the JavaScript code that you install from Google Analytics just doesn't do that. But with custom events, you get a lot of flexibility. So custom events can have basically four properties to them. There's event category, event action, event label, and event value. And so the event category, you can kind of think about that as a way to sort of just categorize the different events that you're having, make sure they're distinct. Commonly, these are different types of interactions. And then you got to have an event category in your custom event, and you also have to have an event action. Beyond the event category, event action, event label, and event value, it's a little bit of how you want to analyze the data. There's not a lot of Google's perspective. So you've got a lot of freedom. So sometimes you'll see sort of out of the box custom event implementations where it'll be like our event category is, let's say, file download, our event action is click, and our event label is like the URL of something that's downloaded. And that's fine and good. But yeah, you also can think a little more broadly about that. So I like to actually try, when I'm building custom events, to give myself as much information as possible using the components of a custom event so that I actually get some actionable information out of it. So it kind of segues a little bit into the Google Analytics module. So the Drupal Google Analytics module, it provides a little bit of custom event tracking right out of the box if you click these three checkboxes in the module configuration. And so it's some useful stuff. So it's basically clicks on outbound links, typo, great. Clicks on mail to links, and clicks on downloads. So that's pretty handy. But if you wanted to kind of go beyond that, then you really had kind of traditionally two options. One is you write some custom JavaScript and put that in like, hey, this call to action or something a little more complex. Or you install like the Google Analytics event tracking module and then kind of work from there. Custom JavaScript, it's very customizable, but a bummer of that is, you kind of need a developer to implement and or update. And I know, at least with my team, developers really like to be working on stuff that's interesting. Putting some custom events has not traditionally been very interesting. And then, you might also have a situation where where for political reasons, it's kind of difficult to prioritize this sort of stuff. So, custom JavaScript is not ideal because it really has to go through code, and that's not great. Another option is the Google Analytics event tracking module. Customizable, but again, it requires you actually implementing custom modules for the events you want to track. It's minimally maintained. The analytics module is well maintained, but there's a production release for Drupal 7. There's an alpha release for Drupal 8. I think this probably has gotten a little passé since Google Tag Manager has become more out there. But that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about is I think it's a really handy tool. So, kind of what's the problem, right? I think, as I sort of said, depending on your sort of development capacity and sort of your development workflow, you might need to wait before you could implement some of the custom JavaScript or get a custom module built to work with the event tracking module. And it's not the most interesting development work. So if whoever controls marketing or communications for a site doesn't have kind of the keys to the kingdom, they might not be able to get it done on a timely fashion. So enter Google Tag Manager. Google Tag Manager is a tag management system provided by Google. It's been around since 2012, so it's a bit more modern. A tag management system is basically a system that is implemented to deploy and manage various marketing tags on websites. And there are a zillion of these. Your Facebook tracking pixel, all sorts of stuff. It's used on the vast majority of sites that use a tag management system. But an important thing, and this is something that I've often run across, is folks here, Google Tag Manager is a new thing, so it replaces Google Analytics, and that's not really true. It sort of works in concert with Google Analytics, or it can. It can also work in concert with a lot of other things, a lot of other tag options. But really, the thing that I think is really powerful about it for our scope is it simplifies implementing custom events as tags, which that's pretty key. So kind of how does it work? So they're basically 4 kind of pieces that are part of Google Tag Manager. The first is the Google Tag Manager container. That's required. Then there are tags, which are also required, and triggers, which are required if your tags to do anything. And then there are variables which you may or may not need to use depending on what you're trying to do. So the Google Tag Manager container, it's some container code that you need to add into your website. It basically allows Google Tag Manager to dynamically serve configured tags to the container on page load to allow interaction and tracking of user activity. Within that container, you can serve tags, which are effectively a piece of code that's usually intended to send information to a system. It fires in response to certain events using triggers. And Google Tag Manager has a lot of different provided tags from different groups. Google Analytics, Google AdSense, I believe, has some. Crazy Egg, LinkedIn Insights, all sorts of different analytics platforms. And then also Google Tag Manager allows you to include your own custom HTML or JavaScript tags if you need to do something that's not handled by tags that are provided by these kind of third-party services. So then kind of the next piece is triggers. And a trigger effectively listens for a certain type of event, a form submission, a button click, something like that. And then it tells a tag to fire when the specified event is detected. In order for a tag to fire, it has to have at least one trigger. If you don't have a trigger, the tag just loads and it sits there. And then you'll have variables. Google Analytics has a bunch of built-in variables, and you also generally need to make a few of your own custom variables. And so the variable, it's like a variable in any programming language. It's a name placeholder for a value that will change. Could be a product name, price, value, or a date, or any number of other things. Tag Manager implements a data layer to temporarily hold values in the client so that they can be interacted with. And that's kind of where the variables live. So basically implementing Google Tag Manager in Drupal is pretty straightforward. First off, you need to create a Google Tag Manager account, and then you need to get your container code, and then you need to install that on your Drupal site. You can use the Tag Manager module, or you can add it directly to your templates. So that's kind of a couple different options. So now I want to kind of go into some common patterns, but I just wanted to kind of pause to see if folks are kind of with me so far. And I've got my my screen maximized, so I can't actually see the chat. So are there any questions or anything that you could relay that I could respond to?
I could get some questions for you, Stephen. I'm going to speak slower because there's a bit of a lag. So Ruby was mentioning that it's hard for her to consider what a conversion is on her site because she's an advocacy organization.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's going to be sort of an user action definition converting into data question. Do you have any ideas on that?
Sure. So it kind of depends a little bit on how you're trying to drive advocacy. I can think of a few different possible conversions. So one, you might look at if you're actually trying to direct folks to take specific action, like send emails or make phone calls or something like that. If you've got links that are helping people accomplish that, like a form submission or like a telephone link or something like that, you could probably track those interactions as conversions. Another thing that might be valuable is if you've got like newsletter signups or something like that, that can be helpful as a conversion to track. Now you might say, hey, I know who signed up for the newsletter, so why do I need to track this? But you have basically who signed up for the newsletter, but you don't necessarily know the interactions that they did before signing up for the newsletter and how that contrasts with other visitors on your site who have not signed up for the newsletter. And that's really where, if you're able to track that, you can kind of say, you know what, we've got like a Facebook or a LinkedIn campaign or something that really drives this, but this other, like our organic traffic is just not signing up, or whatever that is, or folks that land on this page, they sign up, folks that land on this other page, they don't sign up. So by actually tracking this as a conversion, then you can sort of segment your data and see these are the people that converted, these are the people that didn't convert. You can start to make some sort of judgments about what content is being effective at kind of driving those people to action and what is not. And then the other thing I was thinking that might be valuable from a conversion perspective are clicks for like downloading resources, maybe, since that is generally not visible to Google Analytics by default. So those are a couple of thoughts.
But just to give you some of the stats from people's comments, it looks like we've got about 7 developers and 3 managers, site builders, content managers in the audience today. Some folks are asking about, well, gosh, I installed both Google Analytics and Tag Manager and didn't feel like it was super successful. That I want to make the Tag Manager and Analytics work better. Mm-hmm. I think you talked about that. And as a client manager, as a product manager, as a PM myself, I've experienced all of this pain, and I can identify with every bit of it.
Well, awesome. We are going to show you how to go past that pain into something useful and fairly easy, in my opinion. All right. So I wanted to kind of go over a couple common Google Tag Manager patterns, and I'll share these slides afterwards, so don't worry about too much about that. But the idea here is these are some common website interactions I think illustrate some different aspects of Tag Manager. And so after going through these, you can start to think about, okay, here's a lot of different things that I could do. And then we'll touch on some other capabilities of Tag Manager that are, kind of outside of the amount of time we have today. So the ones I wanted to go over were Webform submissions, offsite link clicks, file downloads, and then YouTube video interactions, because that's sometimes it's a little bit of a special case, and it illustrates some other kind of interesting aspects of how Tag Manager works. So for each of these, we'll kind of go through and say, here is kind of a tag configuration, kind of talk about the different pieces of that in a little bit of detail. And then we'll talk about the trigger that's associated with that. So we'll start off with web form submissions. So there are a variety of pre-made tags in Tag Manager. If you're doing custom events, generally the one you want is the Universal Analytics tag. And it has a lot of different configurations for it. For doing custom events, you want to select the event type of tracking. So that's just built out of the box. And then it's really handy. It says, what's your event category you want? What do you want to be sent as the event action? What do you want to be sent as the form ID? And then you need to include your Google Analytics setting, which is a custom variable that's basically your particular Google Analytics code. So let's kind of glance at what that looks like. So when you create the tag, you're going to say, hey, I want the Universal Analytics. I'm going to make the event type or the track type to be event. So remember, category is just a just free text, and that's something that you want to use to be able to segment when you look at things on the analytics side. Now, these double curly brackets, that's actually signifies a variable, and so for this action, I've actually selected from a pre-built variable, so I can get the URL that a form was submitted on, and then I can also select the form ID, and then I also need to select my Google Analytics variable that I created that is effectively a what my Google Analytics account I want this sent to. So kind of what this gives me right now is when this fires, which we haven't really talked about that yet, that'll come next. We're going to submit an event to Google Analytics with the category of form submission. This event will include in the event action will be the form URL. So whatever page that form event was detected on and the trigger fired on. And then the label that will be submitted will be the form ID. So that is, gives you some information. If you have a lot of different forms on your site, you now are starting to get some useful data. So this is one of the most basic triggers is you're going to do, it's basically all you need to do is select form submission. So what that looks like is when I configure a trigger, my trigger type is form submission. That's a predefined trigger provided by Google Tag Manager. And then I can select whether it fires on all forms or some forms. This is a very basic one. I want to fire on all forms. And then when you configure the tag, you have to select a trigger. And then when you're looking at the trigger, you can actually see any tags that reference that trigger. And we'll do a little bit of a walkthrough later, but I wanted to give folks kind of context before we kind of poke around. So you might say, how do I want to track, like I've got 10 forms on my website, maybe I only want to track a certain one. So we can add exceptions to a trigger. If I just go back, basically if I edit this, I'll see I want to click on some forms, and then it allows me to add exceptions of triggers to either include or exclude, or forms exclude or exclude. And so I can use specific form ID to include. I can also specify to only include submissions from specific page paths. One thing to kind of keep in mind is depending on how you implemented your container code. So let's say you just slapped it into your template, you might need to exclude some paths, just depending on how you did it. All right, so that's kind of super basic, and it seems pretty straightforward. But as we kind of go through these different patterns, we'll add some complexity. So then we'll do offsite link clicks. So it's pretty common, hey, maybe I'm sending people to Ruby's case. Maybe I'm sending people to to go to this other advocacy system that's going to kind of take them and give you more information or drive them to action in a different way. Maybe it's not on your Drupal site. You want to track that particular click. So then we basically, again, we've got the same universal analytics. It's event type of tag again. And we got a different category because we want to be able to segment our events differently when we're looking in analytics. And then we're going to use some different built-in Google Tag Manager variables, the click URL and the page URL. So the page URL is pretty straightforward, but whatever page this event was fired on. The click URL is kind of interesting because you're able to basically say one of the sets of triggers that you've got in Google Analytics are clicks. And you can have any click, which basically gets information or exposes information to Google Tag Manager about the element that was clicked on. Or you could just say, I only want you to look at clicks that are on links. And then if there's a URL there, then hey, you've got some information there. We can actually pass just the click URL, the URL that's clicked on, to Google Analytics. So this starts to get a little interesting. So let's say we've got some links to like an offsite resource, let's say, and we've got some on some different pages. I can then, with this style of tag, when I'm looking in Google Analytics, I can say I only want to look at events. I want to segment by events that were offsite click, and then I could say, hey, this resource is maybe featured on 2 different pages. I can kind of compare the conversions that I'm getting from by the different pages that the event fired on, or I can look at the multiple resources on a single page, see how those are performing, right? So we can start to get some kind of interesting things there, and so we can kind of just see this in the what it looks like when you configure it. Again, the click URL and page URL you select from the kind of the little Lego icon here. Now you can type that in, of course, but that's it's handy to just kind of select it. So for the trigger on this, it's a little more involved trigger. It's not just form submissions. So we're going to basically, like I said, we're going to trigger on clicks, but only link clicks, and then only some link clicks, and then we're going to provide some filtering. So we'll see a bit more of this in action. Right, so again, our type is click just links, and then we only want to fire on some link clicks. And then I've got 2 filters in here. One is the click URL does not contain designhammer.com, because I don't want this to fire on every link click. And I want to basically exclude Design Hammer links because this is from our Tag Manager account. And then also I've got configured to track clicks on telephone links separately, so I don't want to double count that in my offsite link clicks, because a tel link is going to be tel : and then the telephone number, which, if we think about it, does not contain designhammer.com. So if I didn't have this other exclusion here, then this would also be counted as an offsite link, and that's really not what we want to do. So a couple of considerations on that. So you might have a situation where you've got kind of multiple domains, and you're like, oh, I've got different domains. What do I want to do here? You want to think about your exclusions there. If you've got, to either include or exclude what you need to include. So, for example, I've seen it where folks have like a selection of sort of lead capture campaigns, and that's on a subdomain. So campaigns.yada yada. And so we need to make sure that that's included, but maybe they've got sort of an intranet they don't want to be included. You would want to also kind of exclude that. So you can kind of tailor it a bit. So, if you've got multiple domains, that's something to think about. You also, if you've got cross-domain tracking, you want to think about how you're, how that's interacting with the trigger. Make sure you're just getting the right results. If there are subdomains, and particularly if you want to be tracking on subdomains and not others, you really need to just kind of think through what are the different possibilities of where there are links, and which ones do I want to track as actually offsite versus which ones do I want to track as being effectively part of the same site, even though it is not the site that they're on in a true sense. If it's like campaigns, yada yada. So now we'll talk about file downloads. So this is, again, we're kind of building on the same sort of thing. It's universal analytics. It's an event type. Again, we have a different category, file download click, click URL and page URL. So that's pretty much the same. The difference is going to be on the trigger, right? Because this is all very much identical. But this illustrates that we can do some interesting stuff with our included or excluded parts of the trigger. So again, we're going to be clicks, just links, and we're going to only do some link clicks, but we're going to actually use a regular expression. So that I'm basically saying click URL matches this regular expression, which is something that then ends with dot, or that something that includes effectively .doc or .pdf or .ppt or .xls. And of course, you can, if you have different file extensions, you can kind of manage this however you want. And so if we kind of pop back for a second with what we're getting here, that click URL is going to include the file name too. So you're actually not just saying, well, we had this this file click that downloaded a file. We also get what the URL was and what page that it was downloaded from. So that's pretty handy. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of times folks are like, I want to know, how many files were downloaded, how many resources were downloaded. This actually gives you a way to do that. A little quick caveat about that. In real terms, what you're tracking is clicks on links with a file extension in the URL on your web pages, not to the truest sense actual file downloads. So, there's kind of one case that I've run across is say an organization distributes PDFs that then include a link in the PDF that goes directly to the URL of the file downloads that's served from your Drupal files directory. Well, that's not actually loading the web page where your Google Tag Manager code lives. So there's nothing to fire the code to track the file click. So this is not foolproof, but for the common case of we expose files for download, this gives you a way to track those downloads. If you need to do something more exotic, Tag Manager is not going to be able to help you, and Google Analytics by default is not going to be able to help you. You probably, if you need to actually kind of track some other stuff, you need to look at doing something server side, like using Google's measurement protocol, which is a different talk entirely. Another thing you want to think about, as you're looking at this is, let's say you have resources on another site. You want to think about whether that needs to be included or excluded from your offsite clicks, and sort of how you want that data to be parsed, just so you've got kind of consistent filtering for your triggers. All right, so the last kind of common pattern I wanted to show, and then we'll kind of pause for a second for some quick questions and then kind of push ahead for the last little bit, is YouTube activity for embedded YouTube videos. So some nice stuff here is this is YouTube is actually kind of supported natively by Google Tag Manager, but there's some handy things in this sort of pattern that make it a little easier. So the first thing you want to do is actually enable built-in video variables, because when you just turn on Google Tag Manager, a lot of the built-in variables aren't enabled. So you just have to go over and it says enable variables and just click on the ones you want to enable. So you just enable all your built-in video variables. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at a lookup table, which is part of the variable for it's a variable type for the data layer. And we're using this for two reasons. One, the built-in video statuses that YouTube supports aren't the most human readable. They're fine, but they're not great. But also with this lookup table, basically what we can do is we can use a single event tag rather than a separate event tag for each of the built-in actions that happens. So we'll see that a little bit more in detail. So basically, what this looks like is we say create a variable type is lookup table, and then it says what's your input variable, and this video status, that's one of the built-in video variables that Google Tag Manager provides. And then we include the different, on the left here, the inputs. This is what YouTube will report the video status as different things happen. And then we can change that to something that's a little more human readable on the right-hand side. So then, and we're kind of building this one the opposite direction because the lookup table is sort of interesting. Then our trigger is basically, so we've got this lookup table. As there are events for YouTube, the lookup table will be updated. And then our trigger that we're going to trigger the tag on is a YouTube video. So when there's a YouTube video event, and then we checkbox the particular events that we want to have happen, that we want it to trigger on, right? So video starts, video completes, there's some pause or seek or buffering, and then progress percentage. And these are, we can do time or we can do percentage, and you can configure the percentages that you want. And then you can control which videos the trigger fires on. And it's similar to the some clicks, all clicks sort of methodology. And then, now that we're at kind of the top level at the tag, we can look at it. So our category is going to be YouTube video actions. Our event action is going to be the name of your lookup table variable. So basically, when that changes, well, when there's a video thing, when there's a video action, the trigger will fire, and then it will look in your lookup table for what just was updated, and that's going to be your action. And your event label, in this case, we're using two different built-in GTM variables, the video title and then the dash and the video URL. And so that's kind of what it looks like. So these, you do have the ability to do some sort of interesting stuff with your labels and actions. It doesn't have to be a one-to-one variable relationship. So a couple of considerations. This really leverages Google Tag Manager's built-in YouTube support. Other video providers require a bit of a different approach, depending on what they provide. So let me pause there briefly to see if there are any questions about that, and then we can push on through and maybe do a little bit of live demo. I know I'm running pretty late on time.
I'm not sure how much more slides you have to go, so your time is seemingly in alignment. We've got about 17 minutes left, but we want to give people 5 minutes to get to the next session. Don't have any new questions yet. Seems like Google Analytics is a shotgun blast, where Google Tag Manager is more of a scalpel.
It can be. The nice thing is that basically you can sort of create the information that you want to read in Analytics to interact with other information that Analytics provides natively. So that's pretty handy. And there's some other kind of interesting things you can do. So we'll kind of go into some of this now that I think is pretty cool. So let's talk a little bit more broadly about, how do you kind of rule your own, right? These are a couple common patterns. I learned these by Googling them. You can find them as well. There's no right or wrong answer on those. But, you might want to do something a little different. So I think, once you kind of are thinking about, what do I even want to track on my website? What actions do I want users to take? You start off by writing out, what do I want them to do? It could be, maybe I want to click on a particular call to action, maybe a specific form interaction. Maybe I'm just looking for engagement. I want to say, hey, did they scroll all the way down this page, right? There are a lot of different ways of doing that, but as you start to Like I recommend think about what you want to track and then move to the next step of trying to figure out, can Google Tag Manager help me track this as a custom event? So I like to think of it like, once I've got kind of my conversions that I'm trying to track, um, what are the tools that I've got to work with? And I think you really have kind of three tools. You have the built-in triggers, and then you have custom event triggers, and then you also have trigger groups. So we looked at already the click trigger and the video trigger for YouTube videos, and we looked at the mind is blanking, form submission trigger. And those are some pretty common ones, but there are a couple others that I think are really useful. And then there are some others that are, to my mind, less useful, but you might want to look at. One is a page view trigger. So we didn't actually show how to implement page views on the website using Google Tag Manager. So if we think about it, by default, you get code from Google Analytics that is effectively tracking page views. So you can implement your Google Analytics code on a website, and then implement Google Tag Manager. And in Google Tag Manager, I can then implement all my custom events. They can live side by side like that, no problems at all. You also could, rather than implementing the provided Google Analytics code on your website separately, you could create a tag and trigger that are page views, and that it's pretty dirt simple. Basically, you create a Google Analytics tag of the page view type, and you basically then add your Google Analytics variable, and then you say trigger on all page views, and you're done. All right, so it's super easy, but you don't have to do that. But the page view trigger, so you could just trigger a tag on any page view, right? So that could be useful for something like that, or for some more esoteric stuff that we'll talk about in just a second. I think the history change trigger is super interesting. So that's if there's a change in the path of a page. So let's say you've got something that doesn't cause a page load, but triggers this. So, but you need to track it, right? So the history change trigger can help you do that. We had an instance where a third party provided us with this drop-in resource search thing that changed the page path without causing a page load. So we had to do some interesting stuff with the history change trigger and some custom HTML tag or some custom JavaScript tags to be able to track that stuff. The scroll depth trigger, pretty straightforward. It basically is like you can set sort of percentages on the page of when it's going to trigger an event and use that to report scroll depth. And the timer is time on a page since page load. So you can actually use both of those sort of as a trigger group if you want to get an approximation of how engaged someone is with, say, a long blog post. Custom event trigger is pretty interesting. So that basically will trigger on interactions with the Google Tag Manager data layer. So it's a bit more advanced, but really common approach is if you've got either a custom HTML tag that you write that then inserts some data into the data layer variable, then this trigger can trigger on that variable changing. So that's kind of an interesting, more in-depth thing that you can try. And I mentioned a little bit about the trigger group. You can kind of set dependencies between multiple triggers. So the group trigger, which effectively acts as a single trigger, doesn't fire the tag until every trigger in the group is fired at least once. So you once you've got your conversions identified, then you can say, okay, what can I trigger something on? And that kind of helps me think about then how can I construct an event, right? And so the events we've got, I like to use the built-in variables because they give you a lot of information to populate. But it's important to kind of keep in mind how Google Analytics is going to parse the information, and then keep your event sort of format consistent between the different types of events. So the last thing I wanted to show is kind of a neat thing, the preview and debug mode for testing. So we'll just kind of go through this really quickly. I will doing that, and I will share my screen here. So can everyone see Google Tag Manager on my screen?
Yes, we're down to about our last 4.
Great. So basically, once I'm in Tag Manager, I can hit preview. And this enables preview mode. Of course, it waits a second to do it. And then what this does is two things. One, it shows, it allows me to interact with any tag changes that I haven't sort of committed to production yet. So it's a good test mode. And two, in the same browser,
The video cut off for me as well. Michael, can you hear me? I'm going to turn on my video. Bingo. So I can't read the comments at the moment. It seems we have lost our presenter, unfortunately. And I'm going to try and switch to my back channel on my iPad. We rapidly made sure we were contingent against everything except this. Of course. My iPad's being slightly annoying. I don't have information. It seems that the presenter has dropped off. These are our next events coming up in about 6 minutes or so. I didn't have any other questions from the chat to convey to the presenter, I'm afraid. Hate that he was cut off in mid-sentence. It feels a little bit like, says, whatever you do, don't do. I heard a ping, but I can't read what may have pinged me. Where the heck is? Why are you giving me a hard time? Because, of course, Murphy's Law. Just love it. This is why I had everything preset.
all right. Sorry about that, guys. I think the debug mode just kind of didn't like hop-in, I think. Too much going on. I think too much happened for my poor computer to show the debug mode live. All right. So that's pretty much it. Did I lose folks when I went to the debug mode, or did I lose folks before then?
No, I think that's where you lost them.
Okay. Well,
You're saying there were two things, and Michael says before.
Okay. All right. All right, well, I can quickly show those last few slides.
Don't forget to share your screen again.
Yeah, good call. All right. Yeah, and Michael, that's a good call. You probably do need the Chrome plugin for debug mode. So basically, start with identifying the user interactions you want to track. Think about what Google Tag Manager can see. Specific things I think are pretty interesting are page views. That's a good trigger. Changes to the history of to the page path, and then scroll depth and timer triggers can be used kind of in concert for estimating engagement. You can also do custom events trigger. So if basically there's interaction on the Google Tag Manager data layer. And so kind of two ways that often happens is one, you might basically you'll often through a custom tag cause information to change in the data layer, and then this trigger allows you to interact with that. And then you can also group your triggers together. The trigger group won't fire the tag until every trigger in the group is fired at least once. So the only other thing is when you're thinking about event construction, make sure you've got you're using the built-in variables, and think about how this is parsed by Google Analytics, and any consistent. Make sure you keep consistency between your custom events so you can kind of cross-analyze them. And then the live demo was not successful, so we will just go over. And so that's effectively what I have. Happy to hang out, just online and chat if folks have more questions since I ran long. Apologies for the live demo crashing out.
No worries. Thank you, Stephen.